The air in the auction hall hung thick with the smell of too many bodies pressed into too small a space. Traders from a dozen different worlds crowded around the central platform, their eyes cold and calculating as they assessed each piece of merchandise that crossed the block. The station's artificial lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that danced across faces both human and alien. Laura stood on the platform with her shoulders hunched forward and her eyes fixed firmly on the metal floor beneath her bare feet. Her brown hair fell in tangled clumps around her face, unwashed and uncared for. The rags she wore had once been a standard-issue work uniform, but months of neglect had reduced them to little more than strips of fabric held together by stubborn threads. Her arms hung loose at her sides, and if someone looked closely, they could count 7 thin scars running in parallel lines down her left forearm. 7 marks. 7 failures. 7 owners who had returned her as defective. She was 21 years old, though she looked older. The years had not been kind. The auctioneer was a hectarian, a species known for their 4 arms and their complete lack of emotional expression. He stood behind his podium, cycling through his inventory with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. He had been at this for 6 hours now, and his voice had long since gone flat. Item 732, he announced in Galactic Common, the trade language that most species used for business. Human female. Approximately 20 standard years of age. Previous experience in maintenance work and basic labor tasks. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Near the front, a massive Vraxian slaver leaned toward his companion, his voice loud enough for half the room to hear. Previous experience in failure, more like, I know that one. She came through the Outpost 12 batch 3 cycles ago. Couldn't follow simple instructions. Couldn't complete basic tasks. She's the broken one. More laughter. Laura did not react. She had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. The auctioneer pressed forward, though even he seemed to know this was a losing battle. Starting bid at 200 credits. Silence filled the hall. 200 credits was already insultingly low for a healthy human, but no hands went up. No voices called out. The crowd simply stared at Laura with the kind of disinterest usually reserved for broken equipment. 100 credits? The auctioneer tried again. Still nothing. Someone in the middle of the crowd made a comment in their native language. Laura did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. Others laughed in response. 50 credits, then. The Vraxian from before spoke up again, his scales rattling with amusement. You would have better luck selling her by weight to the recycling plants. At least then she would be worth something. The crowd found this hilarious. Laura kept her eyes on the floor and waited for it to end. It always ended the same way. Eventually, someone would take pity on the auctioneer and buy her for almost nothing, work her until she failed at some task she did not understand, and then return her for a refund. The cycle had repeated 7 times now. She saw no reason why an 8th time would be any different. 25 credits, a voice called from the back of the hall. The laughter died. The crowd turned to see who had spoken. Even Laura glanced up, though she caught only a glimpse of movement in the shadows near the exit. The auctioneer's face showed something that might have been relief if hectarians were capable of such expressions. 25 credits is bid. Do I hear 30? Silence. 25 credits going once. Going twice. A human male pushed through the crowd. He was perhaps 50 years old, with gray streaking through his brown hair and deep lines etched around his eyes. He wore practical spacer clothing, a worn jacket, sturdy pants, and boots that had seen countless station floors. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going and why. Sold to the gentleman in the back for 25 credits, the auctioneer said quickly before anyone could object or before the human could change his mind. Transfer of ownership will be processed immediately. Next item. The man climbed the steps to the platform while the crowd's attention had already moved on to the next lot. Laura watched him approach, her body tensing automatically. She knew what came next. They always touched her roughly, grabbed her arm, put a collar around her neck, or shoved her toward the exit. She had learned to move quickly when they did, to make herself small, to avoid giving them any reason to hurt her more than they already planned to. But this man stopped a few feet away. His hands stayed at his sides, visible and unthreatening. He looked at her face, not at her body or her scars, just at her eyes. "Can you walk?" he asked. The words were in English. Pure, simple English. Laura's head snapped up so fast her neck cracked. English. She had not heard another human being speak her native language in 3 years. Not since the colony raid. Not since the day she was captured and thrown into the cargo hold of a slaver ship with 24 other terrified teenagers. Her mouth opened. Her throat worked. But no sound came out. Her voice had forgotten how to make words. The silence stretched between them. "It's all right," the man said quietly, still in English. "You don't have to talk right now. Let's just get you out of here, okay?" He turned and walked toward the steps that led down from the platform. He did not grab her. He did not force her to follow. He simply walked, glancing back once to see if she was coming. Laura's legs moved before her brain fully processed what was happening. She followed him down the steps, through the crowd that was already ignoring her existence, and toward the exit. Behind her, the auctioneer's voice droned on. Item 733 was a Delphian male with engineering experience. The bidding started at 500 credits. The man led her through the station's corridors without speaking. Laura walked 3 steps behind him, her eyes tracking his movements, waiting for the moment when he would turn on her or hurt her or reveal himself to be just like all the others. But that moment did not come. He just walked, steady and unhurried, until they reached a docking bay where a mid-sized cargo ship waited. The name Stellar Dawn was painted on the hull in fading letters. The man stopped at the bottom of the loading ramp and turned to face her. "My name is Thomas Grant," he said in English. "I'm the captain of this ship. You're going to be okay now." Laura stared at him. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that 25 credits and a few kind words in her own language meant something real. But 7 scars on her arm told a different story. 7 owners had promised things too in their own ways. 7 times she had failed them or they had failed her. She was no longer sure which was true. Thomas seemed to understand her doubt. He nodded slowly and gestured toward the ship. "Come on. Let's get you cleaned up and fed. We can figure out the rest later." He walked up the ramp and once again Laura followed. She had been sold for nothing and labeled worthless by everyone who had ever owned her. As the ramp closed behind her and the Stellar Dawn prepared to leave Kelver 9 station, she wondered if Thomas Grant would become her 8th failure, or if maybe, just maybe, something might actually be different this time. The quarters Thomas showed Laura to were small but clean. A narrow bed sat against one wall, with fresh sheets folded neatly at the foot. A small sink and mirror occupied the corner, and a locker stood ready for belongings she did not have. Laura stood in the doorway, unable to move forward or backward, staring at the space as if it might be a trap. Thomas set a bundle of clothing on the bed. "These should fit well enough. The shower is down the hall, second door on the right. Take your time. I will bring food in about an hour." He left without another word, the door sliding shut behind him. Laura waited for the click of a lock, for the sound of chains or restraints being set. Nothing came. She approached the door carefully and touched the control panel. The door opened immediately. No lock. No trap. Just an open door she could walk through whenever she wanted. She did not understand. The shower was hot and the water pressure was gentle. Laura stood under the spray for a long time, watching 7 years of grime and blood and fear swirl down the drain. The soap smelled clean like something from before. Like the colony where she had grown up. She scrubbed her skin until it hurt, then scrubbed it again, trying to wash away the memories that clung tighter than any dirt. When she returned to her quarters wearing the clean clothes Thomas had provided, she found a tray of food waiting on the small desk. Real food. Not the nutrient paste or stale rations she had survived on for years. There was bread, some kind of stew that smelled like vegetables and meat, and a cup of something hot that might have been tea. Laura ate slowly, waiting for her stomach to reject it, but the food stayed down. Thomas came by an hour later and collected the empty tray. "Better?" he asked in English. Laura nodded. Her voice still would not work. "Good. Get some rest. We leave station in 6 hours." He left again and Laura lay down on the bed, certain that sleep would not come. But her body had other ideas. Within minutes, exhaustion pulled her under, and for the first time in 3 years she slept without fear of being woken by a beating. The days that followed created a strange new pattern. Thomas would bring her food 3 times a day. He would check on her, ask if she needed anything and then leave her alone. He never raised his voice. He never lifted his hand. He never demanded anything from her. Laura spent most of her time sitting on the bed, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for him to show his true nature. On the 4th day, Thomas sat down in the chair across from her bed and spoke in his quiet, steady voice. "I need to know your story, Laura. Not because I want to hurt you with it, but because I need to understand what happened to you. Will you tell me?" Laura's throat felt tight, but after 3 years of silence, the words finally came. They came slowly at first, broken and halting like water from a rusted pipe. She told him about the colony on Deneb 7. About her family. About being 14 years old and helping her father repair the irrigation systems when the raiders came. She told him about the cargo hold of the slaver ship, about the other children who screamed and cried while she stayed silent and tried to make herself invisible. She told him about her first owner, a Corthan factory supervisor who had bought her for assembly line work. He had shouted instructions at her in Corthan, a language she did not speak, and when she failed to understand, he had beaten her with a metal rod. After 2 months, he had returned her as defective. The second owner was a Vraxian mining operation manager. He had spoken Galactic Common, which Laura knew only a handful of words of at the time. He expected her to operate complex machinery after watching a single demonstration. When she made mistakes, he withheld food. When she made more mistakes, he beat her. After 3 months, he sold her at a loss. The pattern repeated. Owner 3. Owner 4. Owner 5. Each one spoke languages she barely understood. Each one expected her to learn complex tasks with minimal instruction. Each one grew frustrated when she failed. Each one hurt her in different ways. By the time she reached Owner 6, she had stopped trying to understand. By Owner 7, she had stopped speaking entirely. Thomas listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, her voice hoarse and her eyes dry of tears she had cried out years ago, he sat quietly for a moment. "You were never defective," he said finally. "You were a child taken from your home and thrown into situations where you could not possibly succeed. They set you up to fail and then they punished you for failing. That was never your fault." Laura wanted to believe him, but 7 scars on her arm told her otherwise. "I could not do what they asked. I tried, but I could not." "Because they did not give you the tools to succeed," Thomas said. "They did not speak your language. They did not train you properly. They treated you like a machine that should work perfectly the moment they turned it on, and when you did not, they blamed you instead of themselves." He stood up and moved toward the door, then paused. "Tomorrow, I am going to ask you to help me with some repairs in the engine room. I will explain everything in English, slowly and clearly. If you do not understand something, you will tell me and I will explain it again. We will see what happens. Is that all right?" Laura nodded, though fear twisted in her stomach. The next morning, Thomas took her to the engine room. The space was cramped and hot, filled with pipes and panels and blinking lights that meant nothing to her. Thomas pointed to a panel on the wall. "This panel controls the coolant flow to the secondary generator," he explained in English, speaking slowly and clearly. "I need you to remove these 6 bolts using this wrench. Turn them counterclockwise, that means to the left. Once all 6 bolts are out, carefully lift the panel away and set it on the floor. Can you do that?" Laura stared at the panel, at the wrench in her hand, at the 6 bolts he had indicated. The instructions were clear. She understood every word. Slowly, carefully, she positioned the wrench on the first bolt and turned it to the left. The bolt loosened. She removed it and set it aside, then moved to the second bolt. 20 minutes later, all 6 bolts sat in a neat row on the floor, and the panel rested beside them. Laura looked up at Thomas, her heart pounding. Thomas smiled. "Perfect. Exactly right. Now do you see these 3 wires here? The red one, the blue one, and the green one?" She nodded. "I need you to disconnect them in this order. Green first, then blue, then red. To disconnect them, you press this small button on the side of the connector and pull gently. Try the green one first." Laura pressed the button. The connector released. She pulled it free. "Good. Now the blue one." She did it again. Then the red one. 3 wires disconnected just as he had asked. Thomas handed her a replacement component. "Now we connect the new part. Red first this time, then blue, then green. Push them in until you hear a click." Laura's hands shook slightly, but she completed the task. Click, click, click. 3 wires connected. "Now put the panel back on and replace the bolts. Remember, clockwise this time, to the right." She did. 6 bolts, tightened carefully in the reverse order she had removed them. Thomas checked her work, running his hands over the connections and testing the panel. "Flawless," he said. "You did it perfectly." Laura stared at him, then at her hands, then back at him. "I did it? You did it? Do you know why?" She shook her head. "Because I gave you clear instructions in a language you understand. Because I showed you exactly what to do and gave you time to do it. Because you were never broken, Laura. You just needed someone to actually teach you instead of expecting you to already know." Something cracked open inside Laura's chest, something that had been locked away for years. Her vision blurred and she realized she was crying. Not the silent, despairing tears of her captivity, but something different. Something that felt almost like relief. Thomas handed her a clean cloth. "You are going to be fine," he said quietly. We will take it slow, but you are going to be just fine. For the first time since she was 14 years old, Laura thought he might actually be right. The Stellar Dawn carried a crew of 5, not counting Laura. Thomas was the captain and primary pilot. Karen was the navigator, a quiet woman in her 30s who had lost her own family to raiders years before. Mitchell served as the cargo master and handled trade negotiations at each port. The final 2 crew members were aliens: Prax, a Corthan engineer with 4 arms and a temper to match, and Scylla, a Delphian communications officer whose translucent skin shifted colors with her moods. At first, the crew treated Laura with cautious kindness, the way one might treat a wounded animal. They spoke softly around her. They gave her space. They did not ask questions about the scars on her arm or the way she flinched at sudden movements. Karen would smile at her in the corridors. Mitchell would nod politely when they passed. Prax ignored her entirely, which Laura actually appreciated. Scylla's skin would turn soft blue whenever Laura entered a room, which Thomas explained meant sympathy or concern. Thomas started Laura's real education 2 weeks into the journey. Every morning after breakfast, he would sit with her in the common area with a data pad and teaching modules. He taught her Galactic Common from the ground up, starting with basic words and building slowly to more complex grammar. Unlike her previous owners, he did not expect her to learn overnight. He was patient when she struggled. He praised her when she succeeded. He made learning feel safe instead of terrifying. Laura discovered that her mind worked differently than she had thought. When Thomas showed her a word in Galactic Common, she could see it in her memory later, exactly as it had appeared on the screen. When he taught her a technical term, she could recall not just the word but the entire conversation around it. Thomas noticed this quickly. "You have a photographic memory," he told her one afternoon. "That is a rare gift. Most people have to study information multiple times to remember it. You can see it once and keep it." Laura had never thought of her memory as a gift. In her previous situations, it had only meant she remembered every beating, every insult, every moment of pain with perfect clarity. But here, with Thomas teaching her and giving her useful information, that same memory became something valuable. As her language skills improved, Thomas began giving her more complex tasks in the engine room. He would explain what needed to be done, then let her work while he watched. At first, he corrected her often but always gently, always with an explanation of why something needed to be done differently. Within a month he rarely needed to correct her at all. Prax the engineer noticed the change. He had been skeptical when Thomas brought a human slave girl aboard and even more skeptical when Thomas started teaching her engineering. Corthan culture valued technical skill above almost everything else, and Prax had spent decades mastering his craft. The idea that this damaged human could learn engineering seemed laughable to him. But Prax was honest enough to recognize skill when he saw it. One afternoon he was struggling with a stuck valve in the water recycling system. The valve had been sticking for weeks, and he had tried every standard solution in his considerable knowledge base. Nothing worked. He was about to disassemble the entire system when Laura appeared in the doorway. "May I look?" she asked in careful Galactic Common. Prax wanted to say no. His pride wanted to refuse her help. But curiosity won out. He gestured to the valve with one of his 4 hands. "Be my guest." Laura knelt beside the valve and studied it for several minutes without touching anything. Her eyes moved over the pipes, the connections, the wear patterns on the metal. Then she stood up and walked to the parts locker, returning with a small rubber mallet and a tube of lubricant. "This will sound wrong," she said, her Galactic Common halting but clear. "But I think the problem is not the valve. The problem is the pipe behind it. The pipe has a small bend that should not be there. The bend creates pressure. The pressure makes the valve stick." Prax stared at her. "That is impossible. These pipes are manufactured to exact specifications. They do not bend." "They do if the mounting bracket loosens over time," Laura said. She pointed to a bracket that held the pipe to the wall. "See? This bolt here is not as tight as the others. The pipe has shifted maybe 3 millimeters. Not much but enough." Prax checked the bolt. She was right. It was loose. But that still did not explain how she knew the pipe had bent or that the bend was causing the valve problem. Laura must have seen his doubt. She picked up the rubber mallet and gently tapped the pipe at a specific point, about 30 centimeters from the valve. Something inside the pipe shifted with a soft metallic sound. Then she applied lubricant to the valve and turned it. The valve moved smoothly without any resistance. "The pipe had a stress point from the shift," Laura explained. "The stress point created a tiny buckle in the inner wall. The buckle restricted water flow, which increased pressure at the valve. The pressure made the valve stick. I just moved the buckle away from the direct flow path. It will hold for a few weeks, but you should replace the mounting bracket soon and maybe reinforce the pipe at that stress point. Prax tested the valve 3 more times. It worked perfectly. He looked at Laura with something approaching respect in his large eyes. How did you know where to hit the pipe? Laura shrugged. I just saw it. The way the metal reflected the light showed where the stress was. And human plumbing systems sometimes have this same problem. My father taught me the trick with the mallet. From that day forward, Prax stopped ignoring Laura. He started asking her opinion on problems. He started showing her the more complex systems on the ship. He discovered what Thomas had already learned. Laura had an intuitive understanding of how things worked that went beyond book learning. She could look at a system and see not just what it was supposed to do, but what it was actually doing and why those two things might be different. The crew began to relax around her. Karen taught her to play an old Earth card game in the evenings. Mitchell would share stories about the various ports they visited and the strange traders he had met. Scylla's skin turned warm yellow when Laura entered the room now instead of sympathetic blue. Even Laura herself began to change. She smiled more. She laughed at Mitchell's terrible jokes. She started conversations instead of just responding to them. 6 weeks into the journey, disaster struck. The ship was 3 days from the nearest station, hauling a time-sensitive cargo of medical supplies that would earn them a substantial bonus if delivered on schedule, when the quantum drive failed. Not a minor malfunction or a simple part failure, but a complete system crash that left them dead in space. Prax spent 4 hours diagnosing the problem, his 4 arms moving frantically over the drive's control systems. Finally, he emerged from the engine room, his scales dull with frustration. The quantum coils have desynchronized, he announced to Thomas. I can fix it, but I need parts we do not have. We must limp to the nearest station on conventional drives. It will take 3 weeks, maybe 4. The medical supplies will spoil. We will lose the cargo and the bonus and possibly face penalties for late delivery. Thomas took the news with his usual calm, but everyone could see the tension in his shoulders. This cargo represented 2 months of profit. Losing it might mean they could not afford repairs at the next port. Laura had been listening from the corridor. May I see the drive? She asked quietly. Prax looked at Thomas, who nodded. It cannot hurt to look. Laura spent the next 6 hours in the engine room, not touching anything at first, just observing. She studied the quantum drive from every angle. She pulled up the technical specifications on a datapad and read through them twice. She cross-referenced the specs with the actual installation. Then she started taking measurements, checking tolerances, and making notes. When she finally emerged, she found Thomas and Prax in the common area. I think I can fix it, she said. Prax's skepticism returned. Laura, I appreciate your confidence, but quantum drives are extremely complex. The coils must be synchronized to within 1/1,000,000th of a standard unit. The equipment needed to perform that calibration is designed for quantum drives built by Corthan shipyards, Laura interrupted. But this ship was built by humans 70 years ago. The quantum drive is human-made, not Corthan-made. It uses different principles. Thomas leaned forward. Explain. Laura pulled up a schematic on her datapad. Corthan quantum drives use magnetic synchronization. The coils align based on magnetic field strength. But human drives from this era used resonance synchronization. The coils align based on vibration frequency. Your diagnostic tools are measuring magnetic fields, so they say the coils are desynchronized. But the coils do not care about magnetic fields. They care about resonance. Prax stared at the schematic. That is, highly irregular. Human engineering often is, Laura said with a small smile. We tend to solve problems in ways that do not follow standard patterns. If I am right, I can resynchronize the coils using nothing but a frequency generator and about 3 hours of careful adjustment. Thomas looked at Prax. Is it worth trying? Prax's pride wrestled with his practical nature. Finally, practical one. If she breaks it worse, we are no worse off than we already are. Laura did not break it. She spent 3 hours in the engine room with a frequency generator, manually adjusting each quantum coil while monitoring the resonance patterns. It was delicate work that required absolute precision and unwavering focus. When she finally activated the drive, it hummed to life exactly as it should, all systems green, all coils perfectly synchronized. Prax checked her work 3 times before he would believe it. Thomas ran a full diagnostic. The drive was not just fixed, it was operating more efficiently than it had in months. Mitchell clapped Laura on the shoulder. You just saved us 4 months of income. Karen hugged her, which made Laura stiffen in surprise before she carefully hugged back. Scylla's skin turned brilliant gold, which meant joy and celebration. Even Prax offered her a respectful nod, which from a Corthan engineer was essentially a standing ovation. Thomas just smiled at her with quiet pride. Well done, Laura. Well done. That night, lying in her bunk after the crew had celebrated with a special dinner, Laura thought about how much had changed. 2 months ago, she had been worth 25 credits and labeled too broken to be useful for anything. Now she had just saved her crew from financial disaster using skills she had not even known she possessed. She was not worthless. She never had been. She had just needed someone to give her a chance to prove it. Nexus Station orbited a blue giant star and served as one of the largest trading hubs in the sector. Ships from hundreds of worlds docked at its massive rings, trading everything from raw minerals to exotic foods to information itself. The Stellar Dawn had arrived 3 days earlier to deliver their medical supplies and to negotiate a new contract for a cargo run to the inner systems. Laura walked beside Thomas through the station's main commerce deck, her steps confident and her head held high. She wore a clean engineer's jumpsuit with the Stellar Dawn patch on the shoulder. Her hair, now properly cut and cared for, was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She carried a data pad with the specifications for the cargo they were considering, and she had already identified 3 potential problems with the shipment that Thomas would need to negotiate around. 3 months ago, she had shuffled through these same types of corridors with her eyes on the ground, silent and afraid. Now she walked like she belonged here because she did. She was the chief engineer of a working merchant vessel, and she was good at her job. The crew respected her. Thomas trusted her judgment. Even Prax had started asking her opinion before making major decisions about ship systems. They were heading to meet a potential client in one of the station's nicer commerce offices when Laura saw him. She stopped walking so suddenly that Thomas took 3 more steps before realizing she was no longer beside him. Laura? What is wrong? She could not speak. Her throat had closed. Her hands had started shaking. 20 meters ahead, standing outside a cargo broker's office, was Krell, the Vraxian slaver who had been her 4th owner. The one who had beaten her with a shock rod when she failed to understand his instructions. The one who had withheld food for days when she made mistakes. The one who had finally sold her at a loss after 3 months, declaring her too stupid to be worth feeding. Krell was speaking with 2 other traders, his large body blocking part of the corridor. His scales were the dark green of his species, and his eyes were the cold yellow of a predator. He wore expensive clothing now, which meant his slaving business was doing well. Thomas followed her gaze and his expression hardened. He knew her story. He knew what each of her 7 scars represented, and he knew that Krell was the 4th scar. We can go another way, Thomas said quietly. Laura took a deep breath. Then another. Her hands were still shaking, but something inside her was stronger than the fear. She was not the same person Krell had owned. She was not that broken, silent girl anymore. No, she said in English, then switched to Galactic Common. No. We go this way. I am not afraid of him anymore. Thomas studied her face, then nodded. I am right beside you. They walked forward. Laura kept her head up and her steps steady, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. As they approached, Krell glanced their way with casual disinterest, the way one might glance at furniture. His eyes passed over Laura without recognition. They were almost past him when Thomas's name was called by the cargo broker Krell had been speaking with. It was someone Thomas knew from previous trades, and custom demanded they stop and exchange greetings. Laura stood slightly behind Thomas, her heart pounding but her expression calm. Krell's attention drifted to her during the conversation. His eyes narrowed as he studied her face. She saw the exact moment recognition hit. His mouth opened slightly in surprise, then twisted into a cruel smile. Well, Krell said in Galactic Common, his voice carrying the same contemptuous tone Laura remembered from nightmares. I know that face. That is my defective human. The one who could not follow simple instructions. The conversation around them stopped. Thomas turned slowly to face Krell, his body language shifting into something protective and dangerous. Krell either did not notice or did not care. He stepped closer to Laura, looking her up and down. Someone cleaned you up. Put decent clothes on you. But I can still see what you are. Worthless then, worthless now. Laura's hands clenched into fists, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. She would not let him see her fear. She would not give him that power over her again. She is my chief engineer, Thomas said, his voice cold and flat. And she is crew, not property. You will address her with respect or you will not address her at all. Krell laughed, a harsh sound that made several other traders turn to watch. Chief engineer? This broken thing? Captain, someone has lied to you. I owned her for 3 months. She could not complete the simplest tasks. She could barely understand instructions. I lost money on her, even selling her for scrap value. Perhaps, Laura said, her voice steady in galactic common, you should have tried giving instructions in a language I could understand. Krell's eyes snapped to her, surprised that she had spoken. More surprised that she had spoken clearly and correctly in galactic common. I gave you perfectly clear instructions, Krell said. You were simply too stupid to follow them. You gave me instructions in Vraxian, Laura said. I was 15 years old. I had been a slave for less than a year. I spoke only English and a handful of words in galactic common. You never once tried to communicate in a language I understood. You beat me when I failed at tasks I was never properly taught. You starved me when I made mistakes that came from confusion, not incompetence. And then you sold me and told everyone I was defective so you could save face for your own failures as an owner. The growing crowd around them murmured. Krell's scales darkened with anger. Careful little human, he growled. You are on a civilized station now, but accidents happen. Perhaps I should buy you back and teach you proper respect. I will give your captain 500 credits for you right now. That is generous, considering you are only worth your weight in recycling. She is not for sale, Thomas said. At any price. Krell's hand moved toward Laura's arm. Maybe I do not need to buy her. My records show I sold her under disputed terms. That gives me legal claim too. Laura stepped back away from his reaching hand, and her voice cut through the crowd like a blade. If you want to discuss legal claims, Krell, we can do that. But first, let me ask you something. Is that your ship in docking bay 47? The Razor Wind? Krell stopped, confused by the sudden change in topic. What does that matter? Because, Laura said, her voice carrying clearly to everyone watching, I happened to notice when we docked nearby that your quantum drive cooling system has a critical leak. The kind of leak that will cause a cascade failure within the next week. Maybe less. And when that happens, your drive will explode and take half your ship with it. Krell's confidence faltered. You are lying. My engineer checked all systems before we docked. Your engineer missed it, Laura said calmly. The leak is in a secondary line that most engineers do not check because it is usually stable. But your ship is at least 40 years old, and that line degrades over time. I can see from here that your ship sits lower on its landing struts than it should, which means your gravity plating is compensating for a weight distribution problem. That problem is caused by coolant pooling in your lower decks because it is leaking from that secondary line. You probably have about 300 liters of coolant slowly flooding your cargo bay right now. The crowd was silent. Krell stared at her. One of the traders pulled out a data pad and began looking up information about the Razor Wind. Furthermore, Laura continued, your loading ramp has a hydraulic problem. I can see the oil stains from here. And your port thruster housing has microfractures that will become major fractures the next time you make a hard maneuver. Your ship is a disaster waiting to happen, and the fact that your engineer has not caught any of this means you are either too cheap to hire a competent engineer or too arrogant to listen when they tell you about problems. The trader with the datapad looked up. She is right about the coolant leak. Someone filed a safety report about the Razor Wind this morning. Station maintenance flagged it as a hazard. Krell's scales had gone pale. That is confidential information. It is public record, Laura said. I looked it up when I saw your ship because I recognized the name from my time as your property. I wanted to know if the person who had hurt me was at least competent at keeping his own ship safe. You are not. You are a failure as a ship owner just as you were a failure as an owner of people. You failed me because you could not be bothered to communicate properly. And now you are failing your crew because you cannot be bothered to maintain your ship properly. Someone in the crowd laughed. Then someone else. Within moments, half the traders watching were grinning or chuckling. Krell, the feared slaver, the successful businessman, had just been publicly humiliated by a human girl he had once called worthless. Krell's hand moved toward the weapon at his belt. Thomas moved faster, stepping between Laura and Krell with his own hand resting meaningfully on his sidearm. You do not want to do that, Thomas said quietly. Not here. Not with 50 witnesses and station security watching. Laura looked past Thomas at Krell and felt no fear anymore. Only contempt. I was never defective, Krell. I was traumatized and isolated and trying to survive owners who saw me as equipment instead of as a person. You broke me and then blamed me for being broken. But I am not broken anymore. I am a skilled engineer on a good ship with a crew that values me. And you are a small, cruel man with a failing ship and a reputation that just got shattered in front of everyone who matters in this sector. Krell looked at the crowd, at their faces, at the way they were looking at him now. With contempt. With amusement. With the knowledge that he had been bested by someone he had declared worthless. He turned and walked away without another word, his shoulders tight with humiliation. The crowd dispersed slowly, traders returning to their business but carrying with them a new story to tell. Laura let out a breath she had not realized she was holding and found that her hands had stopped shaking. Thomas turned to her with something like pride in his eyes. "Well done." "I was terrified," Laura admitted in English. "I know," Thomas said. "But you did it anyway. That is what courage is." They continued to their meeting, and Laura felt lighter than she had in years. She had faced the monster from her past and found that he was smaller than she remembered. The scars on her arm would always be there, but they no longer defined her. She was Laura, chief engineer of the Stellar Dawn, and she was worth so much more than anyone had ever paid for her. Krell did not let the matter drop. 2 hours after the confrontation on the commerce deck, station security appeared at the Stellar Dawn with a legal summons. Krell had filed a formal claim for recovery of property, citing contract law and demanding Laura be returned to him immediately. The case would go before the station arbiter within the day. Thomas read the summons with a grim expression. He is using an old loophole. Some stations recognize perpetual ownership clauses if the original sale was never formally dissolved. He claims he sold you under duress at a loss, which technically means the sale could be voided. Laura felt ice in her stomach. Can he win? He might, Thomas admitted. The arbiter here is Kaldorian. They follow contract law absolutely, even when it produces unjust results. If the paperwork supports Krell's claim, the arbiter will rule in his favor regardless of what actually happened to you. Then we fight, Laura said. We bring evidence. Thomas nodded. We will need everything. Logs, records, testimony. Karen is already pulling together documentation of your work. Prax is writing a technical assessment of your skills. We will make the strongest case we can. The hearing took place in one of the station's administrative chambers, a cold room with metal walls and harsh lighting. The arbiter was a tall Kaldorian named Vorn, whose gray skin and black eyes gave away nothing of his thoughts. He sat behind a raised desk, reviewing documents on multiple screens, while Krell and his legal advocate sat on one side of the room and Laura and Thomas sat on the other. Krell's advocate spoke first, a smooth-talking Delphian whose skin shifted through various shades of blue as he spoke. He presented the original sale documents, showed the clause that Krell claimed had been violated, and argued that Laura was still legally Krell's property under contract law. He did not mention anything about Laura's treatment or her failures under Krell's ownership. He simply focused on the contracts and the technical details of the sale. When he finished, Arbiter Vorn looked at Thomas. Does the defense wish to respond? Thomas stood. We do, Your Honor. We wish to present evidence that the original contract should be voided entirely based on systematic breach of care standards and failure to provide adequate working conditions. For the next hour, Thomas methodically built his case. He presented work logs from the Stellar Dawn showing Laura's technical competence. He showed maintenance records, repair reports, and efficiency improvements she had implemented. He brought forward written testimonies from Karen, Mitchell, Prax, and Scylla, all attesting to her skills and value as an engineer. Then he presented the harder evidence. Medical scans showing old fractures and injuries consistent with beatings. Testimony from 2 other former owners who admitted they had returned Laura because she did not respond to discipline. Records showing that not one of Laura's 7 previous owners had provided her with language training or proper instruction in her assigned tasks. Arbiter Vorn listened to all of it with an expressionless face, asking occasional questions but offering no hints about his thinking. Finally Thomas said, We request that Laura be allowed to speak on her own behalf. Krell's advocate objected immediately. The property in question cannot provide testimony about its own status. That would be a conflict of interest. She is not property, Thomas said sharply. She is a person who has been systematically abused by a system that treated her as equipment. She deserves to be heard. Arbiter Vorn considered this for a long moment. I will allow it. Proceed. Laura stood on shaking legs and walked to the front of the room. She had prepared what she wanted to say, had practiced it with Thomas, but now that she stood here, all those prepared words seemed inadequate. She took a breath and began in clear galactic common. My name is Laura. I am 21 years old. When I was 14, raiders attacked my colony and took me from my family. I have not seen my parents or my home since that day. For 7 years, I have been sold and resold to owners who saw me as a tool that had stopped working properly. But I was never broken. I was never defective. I was a child who did not speak the languages my owners used. I was a teenager who was not given proper training or instruction. I was a person who was punished for failing at tasks I was never taught how to do. She pulled up a file on her datapad and projected it on the room's main screen. It showed detailed technical diagrams, repair logs, and efficiency reports from the stellar dawn. This is my work over the past 3 months, she continued. I have performed over 200 hours of maintenance and repair work. I have improved engine efficiency by 12%. I have identified and fixed problems that the ship's previous engineer missed. I have saved my crew time and money and possibly their lives when I repaired a quantum drive failure that should have been impossible to fix without specialized equipment. I did all of this because Captain Grant gave me something none of my previous owners gave me: clear instruction in a language I understand, proper training, and the expectation that I could succeed rather than the assumption that I would fail. She looked directly at Krell. You beat me because I could not understand your instructions. You starved me because I made mistakes while trying to figure out what you wanted. You declared me worthless and sold me for scrap prices because it was easier than admitting you had failed as an owner. But my value did not change. It was always there. You simply refused to see it. Krell started to object, but Arbiter Vorn raised a hand for silence. Laura continued. Contract law says that owners must provide adequate care and working conditions for those under contract. Not one of my 7 owners did this. Not one provided language training. Not one gave clear instruction. Not one treated me as a person with the capacity to learn and grow. They violated the fundamental terms of every contract they held, and therefore those contracts should be void. She turned back to Arbiter Vorn. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for justice. I am asking that the law recognize what happened to me as a systematic failure and that I be granted the freedom I should have been given years ago. She sat down, her heart pounding. Thomas gave her an approving nod. Arbiter Vorn spent several minutes reviewing documents, his face still unreadable. Finally he spoke. This arbiter has reviewed all evidence and testimony. The original sale contracts contained standard care provisions which required owners to provide adequate instruction and working conditions. The evidence clearly shows that 7 consecutive owners failed to meet these basic standards. The pattern is too consistent to be attributed to any defect in the contracted party. Therefore, this arbiter rules that all previous contracts are void due to systematic breach of care standards. Laura is hereby declared a free person with no outstanding obligations. Laura felt something break open in her chest. Free. She was free. Krell shot to his feet. This is outrageous. The contracts were legal. The contracts were violated, Arbiter Vorn said coldly. Repeatedly and systematically. This ruling is final. Any attempt to interfere with Laura's freedom will result in criminal charges. This hearing is concluded. Krell stormed out, his advocate hurrying after him. Laura sat very still, trying to process what had just happened. Thomas put a hand on her shoulder. You did it. We did it, Laura corrected. Back on the Stellar Dawn, the crew celebrated with a dinner that Mitchell had spent hours preparing. Karen gave Laura a datapad loaded with technical manuals she had been wanting to study. Prax offered her a gruff nod of respect that meant more coming from him than a speech would have from anyone else. Scylla's skin glowed bright gold the entire evening. When the celebration wound down, Thomas called Laura to his office. I have something official to discuss with you, he said. He pulled up a contract on his desk screen. This is a standard crew contract for the position of chief engineer. It includes full crew shares, which means you get an equal portion of all profits after expenses. It includes medical coverage, training stipends, and all the other benefits my crew receives. You have already been doing the job for months. Now I want to make it official. Laura read through the contract carefully. It was nothing like the documents that had bound her to her previous owners. This contract had clear terms, fair compensation, and most importantly, it had an end date. She could leave whenever she wanted. She was choosing to stay. I accept, she said. Thomas pulled out a physical pen and paper, an old human custom. They both signed. Laura looked at her signature on the paper and felt tears prick her eyes. Her first real job. Her first real choice. The next morning, Laura asked Thomas for an advance on her wages. He agreed without asking why, though she saw curiosity in his eyes. Laura went to the station's labor exchange, the polite name for the place where contract workers were bought and sold. She walked through the display area where dozens of people stood in small cells, waiting for buyers. She had been in one of those cells 3 months ago. She stopped at 3 cells. In the first was a young human man, maybe 19 years old, with scars on his hands and a defeated look in his eyes. The second held a human woman in her 30s, thin and silent. The third held a teenage girl who reminded Laura painfully of herself at 14. Laura checked the prices. Between them they cost less than a decent meal. Overlooked, undervalued, forgotten. She bought all three. The dealer processed the transactions with barely concealed surprise. You want these? They are all problem cases. Returns. Difficult to place. They are exactly what I want, Laura said. She took them back to the Stellar Dawn, where Thomas had agreed to let her use the cargo bay for a few hours. The three freed humans stood nervously, waiting for orders, waiting for the cruelty to begin. Laura spoke to them in English. My name is Laura. 3 months ago I was standing where you are standing now. I had been told I was worthless by 7 different owners. I believed them. I thought I was broken and useless and that I deserved everything that had happened to me. But I was wrong. And so are you if you believe the same things about yourselves. She spent the next 3 hours talking with them. The young man was named Peter. He had been a farmer's son before raiders took him. He could not read Galactic Common, and his previous owners had beaten him for failing at tasks that required reading instructions. The woman was Anna. She had been a teacher before her capture. She spoke 4 Earth languages but none of the common trade languages, and her inability to communicate had been labeled as stubborn refusal. The girl was Sophie. She was 16 and had been a slave for 2 years. She cried when Laura spoke to her in English, the first person to do so since her capture. Laura taught them their first phrases of Galactic Common. She showed them how the Stellar Dawn worked. She explained that they were free now, that they could choose what they wanted to do next, but that if they wanted to stay and learn, she would teach them everything Thomas had taught her. All 3 chose to stay. Over the following weeks, the Stellar Dawn became a training ship. Thomas hired Peter as an apprentice cargo handler. Anna began learning navigation from Karen. Sophie worked with Laura in the engine room, her natural aptitude for mechanics becoming clear as soon as someone bothered to teach her properly. The station's traders noticed. Word spread about the merchant captain who had bought a worthless slave and turned her into a respected engineer. About the engineer who had confronted her former owner and won. About the free humans who were building new lives and proving that value was not determined by price. Krell left Nexus Station 2 days after the hearing, his reputation damaged and his ship requiring expensive repairs. He did not look at the Stellar Dawn as he departed, could not bear to see the crew working together, laughing together, thriving together. Laura stood on the observation deck as Krell's ship pulled away, and she felt nothing. No fear. No anger. Just a quiet satisfaction that she had survived and that she was helping others survive too. Thomas joined her at the window. Ready for the next run? Ready, Laura said. The Stellar Dawn departed Nexus Station with a crew of 8 instead of 5. The cargo hold was full. The engines were running smoothly. And Laura, who had once been sold for 25 credits and labeled worthless, stood at her engineering station and knew exactly what she was worth. She was worth everything she had fought to become.